Hello everybody and welcome to a special edition of GvG Profession Playbook, where I will be talking to you more in depth about the staff Elementalist. I had previously planned to do a sister video with this one talking about traits, and even planned on going into some detail regarding runes and sigils and stuff, but frankly it was going to be an entire video of its own. I didn't think anyone would be really interested in watching it, and the more I thought about it, the less I cared for trying to promote people to run the same builds, as that has been a serious issue with guilds not doing their own theory crafting for a fairly long time. So with that out of the way, we're going to talk about choosing your stats, choosing your utilities, your heal, your elite, and of course how to use your weapon skills in combination with one another for increased effects. The first thing you should know is that your heal will be Ether Renewal. It's just by far the best you have available. Arcane Brilliance, you won't be around 5 people to actually take advantage of the percentage increase in your healing, and generally you won't be blasting your own water fields. The great thing about Glyph of Elemental Harmony that makes it the next best heal for Staff Elementalist, for one thing it's a burst heal, for another thing it's a shorter cast, for a third thing it does give you boons, but the reason why Ether Renewal generally takes priority is because it's a 15-second cooldown. Even though it does take you out of the fight for a fairly long time, it heals 8 conditions, and it heals for more than Glyph of Elemental Harmony once you have the full cast channel when you're clearing those conditions. And it's really important to note that because of the low health pool you're going to have, that it's very important that you clear those conditions, because even if you use Elemental Harmony every 25 seconds, you know, when you're in a bind, if you have Bleed and Poison and Torment and Burning all on top of you, you're still going to be losing health, and it'll make that heal less effective on Glyph of Elemental Harmony compared to Ether Renewal, and that's why we choose Ether Renewal. So for the next thing, of course, Lightning Flash and Misform are your bread and butter. Lightning Flash is to get away, and Misform is to mitigate damage and survive a little bit longer. Now the third utility slot is up for grabs. You could take anything. Glyph of Storms is viable. The Sandstorm pulses blind, which makes it pretty powerful. As you can see, here you have Firestorm, not the greatest. Here you have something similar but not as powerful as the Ice Bow number 4. Here you have Lightning Strikes into an area, which is similar to if you were using the Lightning Hammer number 5. But my personal favorite is the Sandstorm, which pulses blind and bleed in an area for 10 seconds. 10 full seconds. It pulses 11 times, both on the moment it's dropped and at the end of the last second of its duration, which comes out to 10 pulses entirely. It's a super powerful skill, and this is basically why you take the Glyph of Storms if you take it. It's just fantastic. It has a longer cooldown than Necromancer's Well of Darkness, but of course it lasts twice as long and it deals damage, so you can't really go wrong with that. Other options include the Signet of Earth, obviously single target mob, self-explanatory. You could take Ice Bow. The number 5 on Ice Bow is pretty good. You deep freeze one target for the entire duration of 5 seconds, and the Ice Storm can of course use on that target afterwards to deal massive amounts of damage in an area. My graphics aren't loading because I just started up the game, but that's what it looks like. Vulnerability and a decent amount of damage. I didn't actually hit that guy, so you can't see it. And of course you get to pretend you're Ash from League of Legends and do a Frost Fan that chills people where it hits, just to show off this time. Stacks vulnerability and does a fairly decent amount of damage. Other possibilities, I've heard about people using Conjure Lightning Hammer, although I haven't tried it myself. I think I've heard of Sebel from Team Aggression and previously Redguard using the Lightning Hammer. I'm not exactly sure how he does it, but having a second static field on a 25-second cooldown is obviously never a bad idea. And of course the auto attack on Lightning Hammer is super OP with the amount of DPS you can put out. As you can see, it blasts on the third hit as well, and blinds. So if you were to just chase someone around, which you can easily do because of this ability right here, you have that ability, and then you get your own Banish on a shorter cooldown than Guardians. This ability does quite a bit of damage in an AoE if you're trying to pressure a downstate. If you just banished a downstate and wanted to do some AoE pressure on top of it, you can. So definitely Lightning Hammer is something to consider. I personally like it. PvE players like it, so you gotta know the DPS on it is high. So it is a viable ability as long as you know how to use it. Although I can't say for certain, I imagine using the static field on here would be something like the JI ring, like this. Although maybe that's too risky, I guess it depends on the situation at the time, especially since your build will be running very glassy. Other utilities that you could use, Armor of Earth is still viable, although I'm not actually sure whether I would personally take Armor of Earth or Cleansing Fire if I was going to take an additional cantrip. I think the condition removal might actually be better, but if you're looking for something a little more aggressive, Arcane Wave is a 900 range AoE. Also keep in mind that all arcane abilities have a 100% chance to crit. So all that power and all that ferocity you're getting, even with the Valkyrie's gear, you won't need to worry about how high your precision is. With Arcane Wave or Arcane Blast, you will absolutely crit. And of course, having the Blast Finisher and the Arcane Wave can be used in very interesting ways, including blasting your big water field in a clash and also dealing damage to the enemy frontline in there. Even blasting Frozen Ground for Frost Aura onto your frontline is another possibility. And of course, if you are being attacked by a gank and you Burning Retreat, you can blast this fire field to deal damage to those gankers and give yourself some might in order to retaliate as well. So all are options. Now as for your elites, Fiery Greatsword is the superior option. Glyph of Elementals is just not very reliable. Most of the interesting abilities that Glyph of Elementals has to offer requires your elemental to actually run into melee range of the enemy, which makes it extremely clunky and unreliable for large-scale fights. And Fiery Greatsword is just far superior. The auto attack is a piercing projectile. It does not travel very far, but it travels far enough and deals enough damage that it shouldn't really matter. The number 2 is pretty much useless. I mean, it will hit up to 10 people in the AoE, but it's such a small distance that I really don't feel like it matters that much. As for the number 3 skill, it is a very powerful attack. It's weak in the fact that it only hits up to 3 targets at a time. Also, the number of impact says 8. That may be true. I think it, from what I can tell, it might be similar to the Guardian Greatsword spin. So it may seem like it only hits 4 times, but that's because it hits twice during each pulse. As you may have been able to see, I hit this first golem what seemed to be twice very briefly before moving through the rest of the golems. So I think it does in fact hit 8 times, although it could be very deceiving, and I fucking lost my Fiery Greatsword already, god damn it. Now as for the number 4 and number 5 abilities, number 4 is pretty much only good for the gap closer. As you can see here, you ignore chill and cripple effects that are attempted to put on you while using this ability, which is pretty nice. The leap damage is single target, which is why you most likely aren't using it to leap unless you want to get to a specific distance. I believe the leap extends the distance of the actual ability, like that. It's about twice as long. And of course the number 5 is probably the best ability on this weapon, as it hits 10 targets for a full duration of 8 seconds with 536 damage. Just watch as I hit 10 targets for pretty reasonable amounts of damage, and it's on a fairly short cooldown. So definitely Fiery Greatsword is the better option among the Ellie elites. There may be other racial elites that you may be able to take advantage of, but as far as just the Elementalist ones go, Fiery Greatsword is definitely the superior choice at the moment, in my opinion. So as far as what kind of build you're looking at running, generally, although I am in SPVP, you will want to be running something similar to this, where you have power, precision, and ferocity, basically as close to full Zerk as you possibly can get. But if you are looking for some extra tankiness, Vitality is better across the board. Not only does it increase your percentage HP and make it so that you can absorb more burst at any given time, it also, toughness also does not have the benefit of mitigating the percentage of your maximum health that conditions deal. Vitality doesn't reduce the amount that conditions deal, but with a higher maximum health pool, they will be less noticeable, and it will give you more time to get off your ether renewal and cleanse off some of those conditions. Also, I forgot to mention this while I was recording the video, but when you go into downstate, you lose your armor, and your health pool is, I think, calculated based on your maximum health. It's something like 300% of your maximum health is your downstate health. So if you are looking to survive a little bit longer in your downstate, then grabbing extra vitality is definitely the way to go. So in general, vitality is what you want to go for. Now let's talk about comboing your skills effectively and how to place them. So as I mentioned in the video before with a couple things, healing range should go on the class because it's large. You can maneuver around other fields in order to blast it, or you can just wait out the timer on those fields in order to blast it because of the duration. It also applies regen. It cleanses conditions. So all those things are great for clashes. And Geyser, when your melee has the ability to focus on blasting a smaller water field and getting a burst heal from that, the Geyser is more effective and more efficient for that reason. So that's how you place your water fields. Now with placing your frozen ground, you're only trying to predict your enemy's movement slightly. You're trying to get chill on as many of their members as possible in order to bait out their condition cleanses and to hopefully screw up their skill rotations because of the reduced skill recharge rate on them, and even stretch them out a little bit because of the minus 66% movement speed. So if they're running straight at you like this, the best thing you could do is drop your frost field just in front of where they're pushing, but still on top of them. And another thing you can try to do while doing this is to try and drop an eruption on top of it. For example, I'm going to drop the frozen ground here where they're pushing, immediately swap, and then throw down your eruption. Now your eruption is just fast enough that it will proc on the ice field. I didn't place it quite right. If you want to try and place it right on the edge of your frozen ground, not only will this help to zone the enemy back, you know, if their momentum is moving into your frost field and then they see the eruption and they start to move back out of it, it's going to give you more opportunities to tick that chill onto them as their momentum shifts because of your zoning. And if they run straight into it, then they're going to hit that eruption. So it's a really effective way to try and maximize the effectiveness of both of those skills with the frozen ground and the eruption. And another thing to consider is if your frontline pushes into that frozen ground onto the enemy, that eruption is going to hit your own melee and proc the frost aura onto them so that they have the 10% damage reduction and of course the chill onto enemies that attack them. So that's a great way that you can combo your frozen ground and eruption together if you're looking for that. Of course, another thing you should always look to do with your eruption is anytime you drop a big water field, you should be dropping an eruption because that will almost assuredly blast your healing rain. Because the delay on the eruption combined with the length of the water field will almost always give the healing rain field priority on what the eruption actually blast finishes. So you'll get some area healing onto your front line in that clash. That's another thing you should constantly be aware of. Also, if you're going to go into a frozen ground and an eruption on initial pushes, or even pushes later in the round that are similar in nature, where you've both had a full reset and are pushing in, don't fall into the trap of necessarily feeling like you need to drop an unsteady ground on that push. In my opinion, especially with the way stability is now, where you should be looking to drop your unsteady ground is wherever you can maximize the amount of stability stacks that you remove from the enemy. So dropping it where they're pushing into to try and force them to run through it once and then hopefully run through it a second time, so that you either remove 2 stability stacks from them, or at the very least you'll remove 1 stability stack as they push in, and then by the time they come back out, maybe their stability is gone at that point from all the other crowd control effects that your team is throwing down. Alright, so since we're talking about using eruption and water skills, I think it's a good opportunity to mention how to use your eruptions, ice spikes, and lava fonts appropriately. Obviously, these abilities all have a wind-up. Eruption taking about 3 seconds to actually go off. Ice spike taking somewhere around 2 to 2.5 seconds, and then lava font taking a second before dealing damage. Lava font being the easier of the 3 to predict and land your damage onto it. But if you are looking to land your damage with your eruption or your ice spiked, there are 2 different ways to do this. Lava font is also included in this. It's either to predict where the enemy is going to move and then putting your skills there. So if the enemy is running towards you right here, drop an eruption on yourself, drop an ice spike on yourself. By the time they move into this, or by the time they leap into it, they'll be getting hit by both of those abilities. And of course you can always, after you drop the eruption, combo it with your fire field. Blast Might, deal more damage. The other possibility of comboing these abilities is obviously to combine them with your crowd control effects. So obviously, as I mentioned before, dropping your eruption on the forward edge of your frozen ground is one way to combo your abilities effectively. That's one good example of this. Obviously, Ice Spike is another ability you can use them with that. Another thing you can do, dropping your eruption and then shockwaving people inside of it, and even because the immobilize will be just long enough that you can start to get those procs off on the lava font, you can also use lava font in collaboration with your shockwave. Another thing to do is to drop your unsteady ground and put damage on top of that. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Obviously you can go for the obvious one where you just drop it real quick and then follow with an eruption and then a lava font, just like I did with the shockwave. Another thing you can do if you want to be a little more efficient and you feel like you're able to predict well enough to accomplish this, drop your eruption and then drop the line on top of it, and then of course the lava font there, and you'll get lots of damage. You'll be blasting might, and that is another great thing you can do with those abilities. So very, very important. If you're looking to deal damage, the most guaranteed way you can do that is that using them in combination with your crowd control effects, your soft CCs like the Immobilize Chill, and your hard CCs like the Unsteady Ground and the Static Field. Now, if you're looking to predict, this is very important. So if you're predicting with your number 2 skills, you're not always going to be landing damage, and that's okay, because pressure does not have to be dealing damage. Pressure can also be zoning. Pressure can be forcing the enemy to choose between pushing into your damage or taking a different route. It's forcing them to decide whether or not trading that damage for whatever position they're going for within the next few seconds is worth the trade. So although you may not be pressuring their health pools, you're at least pressuring their mindset and forcing them to make split-second decisions based on your skills. So if they're pushing towards, let's say for example that your Necros are all over here, life blasting someone like an Elementalist that's baiting over here, and the enemy wants to just push on those Necromancers after baiting them out a little bit, whatever the case may be, just simply drop your eruption as you can see them start to turn towards your Necromancers, and then they'll be forced to make a decision at that point. If they decide to leap on your Necromancers, if all your Ellies are using this same mindset, then you'll have, 3 eruptions going down here. They'll be leaping into 3 eruptions and be getting 6 bleeds and thousands of damage put onto their health pools. And once all your Ellies are able to think the same way and concentrate their damage in a way similar to how Necros drop their wells, you will notice that even Elementalists are able to chunk at enemy frontline. If your melee's pushing into something and you drop that eruption on top of your line, you can also follow it up with maybe a big water field. If you're going into a push, if your melee's trying to capitalize on some of the enemy getting caught on that line, then that's perfect. You just throw up a big water field, or even you throw up a chill field on top of it. So they try and run away, they can't run away from the eruption, and then you blast frost armor on top of your melee as they're pushing in, and it's a very, very powerful combination, and you should be constantly aware of that. How can you chain your crowd control effects with your damage as a staff elementalist? That's what you're trying to do. One thing I really recommend for staff elementalists to do is duel people. Duel people with your staff. I actually really enjoy dueling on a staff elementalist. I used to do it a lot, and although my staff elementalist play is not very good, at the very least I can say that I do land my damage. So since we're talking about eruption and ice spike already, let's just transition to the earth attunement here. Magnetic aura, it's selfish. You use it when you're taking attacks from necromancers, you use it when you're taking attacks from rangers, and that's about it, because there's nothing you can actually block from a mesmer. You can block shortbow on a thief, but that's usually not what you should be worrying about with a thief. So for the most part, it's just necros and rangers. Another thing to note is that you should try and time this if you know that the life blast is going to come, or even if it's the Reaper's Touch, the number 4, the staff auto attack for necros, any one of those. If you know it's going to come, then try and pop it after the necromancer has casted the ability. That way they can't stop you from reflecting it back onto them. Because if it's a good necromancer, which you should always assume that you're playing against a skilled player, that way you'll never be surprised if they actually do end up being skilled and they know when to stop attacking when you have magnetic aura up. All the time I hear people argue with me about the effectiveness of certain abilities, saying that it's really good if they're an idiot. If the person that's attacking you is an idiot, then they just kill themselves on your reflect. Well, what if they're not stupid and then you just wasted your reflect against them? That's not a good argument. A skill is not good when it has the ability to kill retards. The skill is good when it has the ability to outplay a player of equal or higher skill than yourself. That is when a skill is good, and the moments when you can use it to outplay or counterplay another person is when you should be using the skill. That's what is efficient, and that is what's going to help you and your guild as a whole win in GvGs, is when you learn to counterplay and stop assuming that people are retards. Shockwave is very obvious. You want to try to use this ability to emob when it matters. So in a bomb, or if you're trying to help single out a player and help your necromancers or your other elementalists capture that person and keep them from making it to the regroup, or just holding them in position until your melee has a chance to jump on them and finish them off. Whatever is good for you, but make sure you're not just throwing it around. Make sure you're using it when it is intelligent and when that immobilize will actually be effective. So Flame Burst is kind of obvious. Just use it whenever. It's great. It's burning damage, and it does a lot. Watch, 300 plus damage, and I'm running full Zerk stats. Also, this ability just adds an additional condition onto the enemies to build up a Condi wall, and Condi walls, for anyone that aren't aware, is a term I use to describe spamming conditions onto enemies in order to essentially deny condition cleanses. And what I mean by that is by throwing out a lot of really not useless but less powerful conditions, seeing as how there's a lot of condition reduction and a lot of condition removal in the front line, you have to prioritize certain conditions that have a very high impact in a short period of time. So chill, weakness, and immobilize being the prime conditions that have the most effect in short periods of time before they either time out or get cleansed. And a way to, in effect, extend the duration and therefore the impact of those conditions is by spamming a lot of other conditions that don't have high impact, such as burning, such as bleed, such as torment, such as vulnerability, such as blind, all these other conditions, so that, you know, when they go to use a purging flames, they'll be cleansing these useless conditions instead of really critical conditions such as the immobilize, the chilling, and the weakness. And so that's what I talk about when I talk about a Condi wall. So it's very, very important to keep spamming conditions, even things that are seemingly useless, because the Condi wall effect will inadvertently increase the potency of your more vital conditions. Now again, as I said in the previous Staff Elementalist video, Meteor Shower is in most situations best used on the group, unless you have some reason to believe that the enemy melee is going to be hyper aggressive. But even then, since Necros don't have the same mobility as Sword Warriors and Greatsword Guardians, you can still, even if the melee leaps past your Meteor Shower to jump in and start attacking your melee and going hyper aggressive, at the very least you can zone out their necromancers by putting a Meteor Shower on top of them as they're trailing behind the front line and forcing them to dodge roll out and run a different direction and take a longer route to get into an aggressive position and start landing their abilities and giving their front line coverage and pressure to help win out the fight. So zoning out their necros in that sense is still a very, very good use of the Meteor Shower. And even if they have to dodge roll forward through the Meteor Shower, since those meteors will be doing 4 or 5k on a glass necro, if not more, getting every possible second you can where an enemy necromancer is not using their skills is still very, very crucial and can be game changing. And of course, if you are using your Meteor Shower, the same concept applies as before. You should cast the Meteor Shower and then, cast static fields or shockwaves to hit people and catch them inside your Meteor Shower to lock them up inside the meteors to get hit by those. Comboing your damage with your CC, regardless of the skill, is always very effective and something you should constantly be trying to do. Now, to revisit the idea of skill chaining, I'd like to talk about how to respond to gank pressure. So one of your best abilities to react to gank pressure, obviously you have Misform and Lightning Flash, which are both great, but Burning Retreat is another ability that you have that you will be using to react to gank pressure. As I mentioned before, Burning Retreating and then dropping an Eruption on top of your line as you go back is a great way to blast might, retaliate against thieves and mesmers that come into range of you. And of course there's also other things you can do to respond to that from there. You can of course drop down a line on top of yourself after you do so. So when the thief steals into you, or the mesmer blinks onto you, or the mesmer sends its clothes in to shatter on you, or an illusionary berserker starts spinning at you, whatever the case may be, they will run into this unsteady ground. They will get hit by your lightning rod. Hopefully that will kill some of the clones, or at least damage them significantly, and then perhaps the eruption will finish them off. Obviously thieves will be much less interested in attacking you as a target when you damage their health pool to that extent. Obviously being knocked onto the ground by the unsteady ground, you will almost be guaranteed having the eruption land if the thief decides to stay there during the brief amount of time that it has to get away from the eruption after the knockdown effect from the unsteady ground ends. But even after this, you also have the ability to hit them with the number 1. Now this isn't something that many elementalists normally do, and I think there's a couple different reasons for it. One, I think a lot of them tend to forget how powerful stoning actually is. It doesn't do a lot of damage, but 3 seconds of weakness on a cooldown that's only as long as it takes for it to cast, which in this case is a 3/4 second cast with probably what feels like about a 1/4 second after cast. So basically you'll be throwing this every second. And yes, it feels slow. That's because it is. It's not just you, and I think that's why a lot of people don't really think about using this ability a lot, but it is very, very powerful. I mean, the best way that you can reduce damage on yourself is to apply weakness. 50% chance for enemy blows to fumble, whether or not they are crits or regular attacks. Ever since they made the change to include crits being converted to fumbles, which not only means that it no longer will crit and have the increased crit damage modifier that they have, but it would also do half damage on top of that. So very, very powerful ability if you have mesmers or thieves jumping on you. Is it single target? Yes, unfortunately, but that's one less target that's going to be hitting you for massive amounts of damage if you get good RNG at the very least. Another possibility if you don't want to go for the weakness, or maybe you just cast one weakness real quick and then swap over to air. Lightning Surge is a very powerful ability, being able to blind phantasm summons from mesmers or one of their shatters, especially if you're blinding their sword leap. But if nothing else, you still have access to the chain lightning, which will bounce, obviously, and will potentially help you clear clones that mesmers are trying to build up on you. I mean, if nothing else, you still have access to the static field. This will stop clones in their tracks that are trying to run towards you to shatter. It will also hit them with a lightning rod, which hopefully will assist in killing them. And of course you also have access to the Gust, which, as I will demonstrate right here, is very, very powerful because you have Lightning Rod, and that hits for 3k when it crits on a Lightning Rod, which is absolutely insane. And it's an insta-cast. It travels 1200 range, it's a 400 knockback, and ever since they buffed it a long time ago to increase the hitbox of the Gust, it has been much, much easier to actually land. So I encourage you to make great use of this ability. It has so many applications, including stopping a thief from leaping through a black powder. So definitely get into the hang of using your Gust, and of course all these other abilities are great. And of course if you have Panic Strike, or if you see a mesmer is about to use the clone swap to immob you, Windborne Speed will remove that immobilize so that you can get out safely. And now that we're on the topic of air attunement, obviously as I mentioned before, Gust is very powerful. You don't have to necessarily save it for a gank, but I do recommend that you do so. There are also other situations where you can Gust enemies that are trying to stop one of your friendly downstates, and you can also Gust enemies off of enemy downstates if they're trying to power res. And if you manage to actually get that off on them, that will be additional damage from your Lightning Rod and additional weakness on them to make their counter punch less effective. Lightning Surge should just be something that you spam as often as possible. After all, it does a lot of damage, and it is a blind. Static Field. Now, Static Field's placement differs from the unsteady ground because enemies can only be stunned once by it. So maximizing the static field's effectiveness, unlike the unsteady ground where you could strip multiple stacks of stability, or strip one and then catch them on their way back out, or various scenarios apply to various situations, etc., etc. But for static field, the only way to maximize its effectiveness is to simply not miss with it, and also to place it in a position where your front line can quickly capitalize on the static field if it is a successful static, or dropping it in an area where the enemy is already pushing and they're already on top of damage. You just need to have that static field there to lock them down and make it effective. Obviously you don't want to put the static field right on top of the wells. So let's say, for example, that your necromancers have dropped wells right on top of it. So there's a big circle right here where the wells are. You don't want to drop your static field right on top of those wells because it's not going to be as effective. You're going to be catching enemies, you know, after they walk out of the wells, so they won't actually be standing in the damage. So if anything, you want to drop the static field, you know, sort of in a Venn diagram shape where, you know, the edge of it is in the center of the well, and they'll be getting caught in the center of the well, making use of only one side of the static, but the position of just one side of that static is being used to such effectiveness that it doesn't matter that the entire ring of the static isn't catching enemies. It's not necessarily what you're looking for when you drop that static field. Another thing static field can be used for is even maybe you don't even want to use it on the melee. Maybe you want to focus on using it to zone, gank, or necros or other elementalists out of the fight, and that can also be another great application for it. And the lightning rod procs that give weakness and deal damage to enemy gankers will definitely give your gank an advantage in the peripheral wars. Alright, but that'll conclude this video. Just remember to always be aggressive. Always remember that your skills and the pressure that you put out is extremely important for your front line and being able to capitalize on opportunities that you make with your abilities, and also being able to push further and further into the enemy and break them up with that LE coverage. And every second that you are not being aggressive, every second that you are forced to dodge roll and not use your abilities is another second that the enemy is using to free cast and be more aggressive than your team. So you should never just simply run away. You should kite, and kiting is not the same thing, because you should always be using your skills. Even if you have to move in the opposite direction of the enemy, you should always be casting behind you and constantly be using your skills, giving your melee coverage, making opportunities. And every second that you force them to go on the back foot and force them to not use their skills and not output pressure is another second that you are gaining an advantage and pushing that advantage even further and further during the course of that fight, and pushing control into the hands of your own melee. So that's all for this video. I hope it helped, and I guarantee if you guys just play more aggressively and chain your skills effectively, you'll see massive improvements in your performance. So just keep at it, keep pushing yourself, and keep using your head, and one day you will be contending with the best.